Hi everyone, welcome to week 2. This week we're going to be covering an introduction to the key concepts that we're going to be using as a way of theorizing networks in this subject. Last week I introduced you to the idea that networks are a contemporary episteme. This is a leap that I've made from the work of Michel Foucault, who gave us the concept of epistemes. Epistemes share the root word with epistemology, which is a theory of knowledge. Michel Foucault said an episteme actually delineates all that can be said and known and thought in any given time. It's related to Kuhn's idea of a paradigm. We think within a particular kind of episteme or framework. When you look at our architecture around us, when you look at our art and our design, the things we use on an everyday basis, these sorts of things generally signify the sort of episteme that we're in. Now, I say that I've made a leap from the work of Michel Foucault because he passed away before the advent of the internet. But he did give us some possible past epistemes. So last week we touched upon the medieval episteme. This was the idea that predominated between about the year 1000 and 1500, the period of the Middle Ages that some since the era of the Enlightenment have called the Dark Ages. In this episteme, as Foucault explains, the dominating principle was spirit and flesh. People believed that everything had a spiritual origin. Everything, therefore, was dominated by some form of religious or moral code. Even our diseases, as we theorized at that time, had some sort of moral origin, and that tended to be dominated by the kind of humor that you were dominated by. The books that we had at this time were filled with this kind of episteme. So one of the preponderant kinds of books during this time, a time before the advent of the printing press, when monks and scribes would still illustrate and illuminate scripture and scrolls, was the bestiary. The bestiary was filled with illuminated and illustrated beautiful animals. The idea was that God had created all living beings and created them in God's image. So by studying animals, we could learn more about God's creation and therefore about God and the principles of the moral universe. We can see this epistemic idea even infiltrating the kind of architecture that predominated during the Middle Ages. So for instance, cathedrals, where you had spirits, gargoyles, and animals overlooking. During the Enlightenment episteme, a period we'll return to again and again in this subject, in which you've probably already encountered, a period that dominated from about the year 1500 to about the year 1900. As Foucault explains it, it was an episteme that was dominated by categorization, ordering, cataloging, accumulation. The great books of this era were the encyclopedia. The first encyclopedia was authored by Denis Diderot. The dictionary, the first organized dictionary, was put together by Samuel Johnson. And then, of course, we get the taxonomy of species that was given to us by Carl Linnaeus. All of these ideas still predominate and infiltrate today, just as some of the aspects of the medieval episteme do too. But they aren't quite the all-embracing way of seeing everything that they were between these particular eras. And we can see here in this image from the French National Library, this beautiful linear and very kind of symmetrically ordered architecture also shows these inbuilt principles of order and cataloging and accumulation. So we talked last week about networks as a possible present episteme. And so therefore we're using in BA1002 the idea of networks broadly conceived as a way to begin to theorize and observe everyday life. We use this little yellow dot in a lot of our iconography for this subject because we want to signify you by the yellow dot. Ultimately, this subject is about you and your world, and how your world is localized or parochial as it may be, is in many ways that you may have not thought about before connected to an entire global network. So we're thinking about networks in this subject not just in terms of computer networks or digital networks or the internet, but in a broader way, in the way that theorist Manuel Castells talked about. He talked about the network society, and it was a word that he gave us in 1996 to talk about increasing social and scholarly significance of all kinds of networks. You, therefore, are involved in networks. This subject is part of a network as well. And if you meet us in our Collaborate session this week, you're going to meet some of the support people involved in this network. But your cohort, too, and your peers are also part of that network. The university might seem like a big foreign world to you, but the more you become involved in it, the smaller that world becomes. In the documentary that we recommended that you watch last week, we talked about some of the key features of networks. And they also were touched upon in the reading that you had last week. That reading talked about how scientists have begun to study networks. And one of the things that has enchanted them and which they've studied is synchronicity. This idea that suddenly things can all begin aligning at the same time, even though there's nobody conducting the choir of crickets chirping in one example they gave. They just begin to chirp. They talked about how crowds clap, and they just begin to clap in time, even though there is no conductor. Synchronicity is one of the scientific principles of networks. What else? You might be asked that in your tutorial this week. Well, one other feature of networks that they spend quite a bit of time talking about in both your reading and in the documentary that we set for you last week is small worlds. A small world is a network that looks random but has patterns. A small world is dominated by clusters of connections that have just one or two steps between them. So here's a network map of someone's social network on Facebook. And you can see that this person has moved around a bit over the course of their life. But geographically, we can cluster their friends from the various places that they've lived. So, for instance, they might be originally from Kazakhstan. Then maybe they moved overseas to San Francisco to do some studying. Maybe they got a postdoctoral appointment in Portland. And now they're working in Bozeman. They're also involved in sports. They're part of the Thunderbird basketball team. And they're still in touch, of course, with family all over the world. So their life is organized by a series of clusters or small worlds. Within each of these clusters, the links between these people are much smaller than the links that organize the entire population of 6 billion or more on Earth. So one of the things that the documentary talked about, and which social network theorists talk about, are strong ties. Social insiders are people that you may have many connections with, and so they're strong ties. People from your workplace, you'd have many connections with. People from your high school, you'd have many shared connections with. People perhaps from a church or a temple that you go to, you'd have lots of connections with. People from a sports team that you participate in, you'd have lots of connections with. They may not be people that you know closely, but you have many, many connections, and those are considered strong ties. But Mark Granovetter is somebody who you may hear about if you begin to think about network theory more. He was somebody who authored a paper a number of years ago about the importance of weak ties. These are people that you have very few connections with. And he talked about how important they are for joining these otherwise enclosed small worlds. So even though you might yet not know very many people in university, you might find, for example, that one or two people, a key lecturer or a tutor or a classmate that you finally come in contact with once you get to know people in first year, those people might open up a whole nother world to you because their world is organized by lots of small worlds and clusters as well. So weak ties bring discrete worlds together. And both are important to networks and to network sustainability. Social theorists have found, of course, that most people cannot maintain strong connections or close connections with many, many people. They've theorized that most people can only have strong, close connections with something like 30 to 60 people. So we know, for instance, if you're following somebody on social media that has more than 1,000 followers or friends, that they're not intimately connected to all of those people. Those people are people we call connectors. They are hubs. Just like an airport, the Sydney airport or the Brisbane airport, or even on a smaller scale, the Townsville airport is a hub. Those people are hubs too, and they connect many people, even though they have weakly connected ties. And we're going to be thinking about these things in lots of ways throughout this subject. Everybody in the world is connected by only 6 degrees of separation. So 6 is a really important number that we're going to use to organize a lot of things in this subject to just help you remember things. But despite the fact that in week 1 we introduced you to the way that scientists are beginning to think about networks, throughout this subject we're going to be thinking about how social scientists and arts theorists conceptualize networks and have also developed theories for ways that we can organize and consider and study our what can seem otherwise random social lives. The 6 concepts in this subject are power, space and place, communication, exchange, self and community identity, reality and virtuality, and there you have it. Those are your 6 key concepts in this class. Now you might think they sound very straightforward, but this whole class is about defamiliarizing your everyday assumptions about these basic concepts. In many ways, this subject is going to be a crash course in philosophy. So just as an example of that, I'd like you to finish watching this segment of the lecture now, and we're going to hand you over to Hank Green. Many of you may know the Green brothers as very important vloggers, novelists. Hank Green has done wonderful crash courses, and his brother, John Green, is actually a novelist. And you may have read his young adult fiction or seen the movies of some of his young adult novels, such as The Fault in Our Stars. Just by an anecdotal story, there are fewer than 6 degrees of separation between us here at JCU and the Green brothers. That's because at JCU we have a foundation for Australian literary studies. Australian literary studies was something that's really relatively new to the academy, believe it or not. It wasn't taken seriously by people who study literature for a living as academics until at least the 1960s. And one of the first people to introduce Australian literary studies to the academy was the foundation professor of English at James Cook University, and his name was Colin Roderick. Colin Roderick was, in his former life, before he became an academic, one of the early editors at an important publisher in Australia that's still a live-going concern, Angus and Robertson. Through his work at Angus and Robertson and his work at JCU, he founded the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies, and one of the first lecturers that he had at the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies at James Cook University was Dorothy Green. Dorothy Green was the librarian at Sydney University, and she is also the grandmother of Hank and John Green. So there you go, fewer than 6 degrees of separation. If you'd like to stop this lecture now, what we're going to do is watch about 6 minutes of a crash course where Hank Green is going to show us the way that philosophers think about everyday concepts and complicate them or complexify them. I'm just showing you this video because I want to give you a sense of the sort of philosophical ideas that you're going to be encountering in this subject.